Hey, what's up, everybody? In this crash course tutorial for Shadows of Esteren by Studio Agate, I'm going to do a deep dive on Varigals and Varigals. Say what?
Cybernation Uncensored.
All right, so a Varigal is kind of like a nomadic character. In Treecazel, they're pretty much the ones that travel. They're responsible for transporting messages and goods and things like that. You can see from this imagery too, they're typically known for having a careth, which is one of those studded or plated or enforced staffs, great for walking, hiking, long distance traveling, which obviously Varigals are known for. Also can double as a weapon. They're also known for possibly riding horses or Cairneed. Let's show off what those look like. I think those are awesome. Cairneeds are pretty much like a cross between a deer and a horse. They're a bit more fragile, but they're pretty careful when it comes to travel. They're ambitious, but they avoid dangers and stuff. So they just seem kind of like a more detail-oriented or delicate or overthinking horse, maybe. So they're kind of known for safer travel, if you will. But Varigals don't necessarily need them. They can travel on foot just fine and get around. And I'll get into that in just a moment. We'll dive a little deeper on the skills and talents and things like that for a Varigal and different ways to play them. But ultimately, they're, a nomadic character. They are, like I said, known for traveling around Treecazel, transporting messages, goods, things like that. They have a bit of a history to them. I'll get into that in a moment as well. But when I talk about the guilds and things like that, and the reason I said Varigals at the beginning of the video. But let's first read the simple little definition here from Book 1 of Shadows of Esteren, where it talks about a Varigal basically being a traveler, a messenger, a bringer of news, but also of packages. The Varigal is a link between the scattered communities of Treecazel. Spending most of her life on the road, she is generally welcome whenever she reaches a village. Being close to nature, Varigals are often the allies of Demorthin. Their primary domain is travel. Their secondary domain is either feats or natural environment. I'll get into those in just a moment as well and discuss options, disciplines, different ways to play that and lean into those strengths. If you're confused about what a primary domain is, a secondary domain, make sure first you watch the core mechanics crash course that I did on Shadows of Esteren, and then also get into character creation, where I discuss more details about domains and disciplines and things like that, and secondary and primary, all that sort of stuff. But ultimately, you see, it's like I said, a Varigal's kind of like that nomadic character. They're welcome all over Treecazel. The history of them, they used to, founded by a bard. Again, I'll get into that a little bit later, maybe read some of the excerpts from the actual book that I captured here. But, the guild was founded by a bard like year zero. And, originally they worked for the king, and they had immunities between all the three kingdoms and could travel around Treecazel, keepers of peace, basically. Once there was a little turmoil of relationships and things like that, they kind of broke off, made their own kind of independent guild and things like that. But again, I'll maybe get into that a little bit deeper in a moment. But ultimately, like I said, you see they're a nomadic character. They're kind of like, a cross between a nomad, basically. You see how they're friends with Demorthin just because of being so close to nature and stuff. So they almost remind me of like a nomadic druid-like warrior or something, like a combo of all of that, But then almost like Fantasy World or Shadows of Esteren or Treecazel postman or post person, right? The person kind of being the only source of packages and messages and things getting around the land. Also escorts, they make great escorts and traveling. They usually lead up a party. Like I said, the original guild founded by a bard. They're kind of hand in hand like a bard. They can play very social because they get around. They have common knowledge between all the different kingdoms, dukedoms, things like that. Typically, they know how to fit in, So they make a great leader to a group, or at least when it comes to travel and escorting and maybe getting into different cultures and stuff like that. So that's something to keep in mind when creating the backstory of your Varigal or deep diving into how you're going to play it. Maybe you lean into some of those characteristics and strengths. But let's get into some of the unique talents that Varigals have. I mentioned a couple already, but ultimately their reliable knowledge of places allows them to travel faster on foot than mounted typically. So that's pretty cool to know. And that's because of the fact that they know little side roads and things like that, only known to them, which spare them considerable time. It says here, of course, only individuals with a steady foot and a good sense of direction are able to go through the difficult passages they venture into. So they're pretty much trained to do that, and they know all the side paths throughout Tree Kazel. Like, there might be a main road going to a certain village or town or city, and it might take like 2 days to get there, but for them it just takes like a day or a day and a half or something, or maybe even less if they're really cutting through paths and side roads and things. However, it might require some feats, skill checks, right? Some domain checks, basically, for the other characters in the party, because maybe they can't traverse some of those crazy side paths and stuff as easy. The other thing here I want to go over is that, let's see here, they're taught, I'll just read this straight from the thing because it goes over a couple things and I want to make sure I don't miss anything about trail blazes. But they're taught to identify with a mere glance weather changes, tracks left by men, animals, or fiondas, the nature of some herbs and plants, to recognize source of drinking water, and to get their bearings according to the position of the sun and stars. That's awesome. All of that is like what I said, kind of like that nomadic character, but almost a cross between like a Demorthan and a character, a druid style nomadic traveler warrior or something, like because of having those sort of nature skills, right? And then it says here, they are also taught the mastery of trail blazes. These symbols, known only to the Varigals, look like nothing else and have probably been invented by the founders of this group. They indicate the presence of fiondas or brigands, the discovery of a new side road, the location of a nearby shelter or food cache, the change in the I love this part, the change in the attitude of a chief of a nearby village, and many other things. So, they leave these trailblazes, which are like these unique symbols, say carved in a tree or in a stone or in a clay bed of a river, say, and it might just look like a weird symbol or something to everyone else, but to a Varigal, they'll know exactly, like, oh shit, that's telling me there's a Fiondas in the area, or a nearby village, actually, that we're kind of traveling to a nearby village. The chieftain of that village is kind of in a bad mood because he just lost his son to a war, and they're cautious, and you can't just walk right in. You got to approach very cautiously, otherwise you might get taken out by archers at a distance. I'm just making this up off the top of my head, but you get my point. It can really lead to some awesome little side tangents and campaigns and some flavor in the game as a game leader to use, like I just did, just coming up with fun stuff. But as a player, to really make that character lean into some of these strengths, or maybe these are all their strengths, but one or two of these they don't do that well or something, and you work out a fun little luck check or 50-50 roll to see if it works on some of those, and some of the other things maybe you're an expert at. It's a give and take, or maybe all these things as the character, but you get the point. You can absolutely make some of these unique talents be characteristics of the character and give it some flair. Let's get into the Varigals Guild. I mentioned that earlier. I just want to read a little bit of this and then just kind of explain it. I'm not going to read it verbatim, the entire thing. But the Varigals Guild was created by Arenthel. Again, not going to get hung up on pronunciations here, but that's that bard character I mentioned earlier. Soon after year 0, basically founded the Varigals Guild. And originally, it said here, let's see, they were then royal, like I said, royal messengers. Basically, they were mandated, they worked between all 3 kingdoms. They did great, but then it talks about as relations turned sour, the Varigals emancipated themselves from the royal authority and became a public organization. So, of course, they lost their mandate and therefore the protection brought to them. But this way they discovered a freedom in the exercise of their duties that they previously had no idea about. So think that's pretty interesting. And that leads into some interesting characteristics that your character might have, right? So when you develop it, are they full on guild? Are they, still down with the kingdom or certain royalty or something? Or are they anti that? Or they just kind of work with everyone? How does this affect your character? And I think that's just interesting. And then the other thing to notice here is it says Varigals and Varigals because it talks about how some today, here I'll just say actually few Varigals today are part of the organization that started with the guild created by Arenthal. Most individuals who claim to be Varigals are nothing more than lone wolves, travelers, and messengers who have dedicated a life to live a nomadic life. So that's why at the beginning of the video I said Varigals. I think it's funny, but I also think, man, aside from that just being kind of humorous, right? It's really cool. It really gives Varigals depth. Just think of the fact that like some people kind of play like they're a true Varigal, but they're not really part of the guild or organization, which keep in mind, if they're not really part of the organization or a true Varigal, they don't have access to all those side roads. They don't know about the little side paths and way to cut time out of travel. They also don't know about the blazing symbols and stuff. Like they can't decipher the symbols when they see them. So they're not a true Varigal, they're a Varigal. So I think it's interesting, and that could play into your character. Is your character, part of the organization or not? Do they know a Varigal? Were they brought in by a Varigal or not? Or I don't know. There's just so many tangents here that you can see that could really help develop your character. And in the book, they actually go on to talk about how a person is kind of brought into the organization and the guild. So maybe there's some flavor there for you too, if that's the route that you go, or maybe you're already in it. I don't know, but again, I think that these options are just great, and I'm glad that they're there for Varigals. Let's get into some of the domains and disciplines, and how I think you can kind of lean into these as strengths and stuff, and make the character kind of unique because of them. So the first one here is travel, the travel domain, which is linked up to your empathy way. And basically, this is exactly how it looks. It's about traveling, right? It's about techniques useful for traveling and living in the open. Some disciplines are exclusive to Varigals, as it says here. And when you get into the disciplines, you can see here, carriages, cartography, navigation, orientation, things like that, riding, and then side roads, which is exclusive to Varigals, which is basically them finding shortcuts, right? And then signs, which is basically Varigals' ability to notice the signs left in nature by their peers, mark announcing a danger, a presence of Fiondus, a nearby waterhole, etc. So yeah, this is kind of the primary for a Varigal. Understandably, you can see exactly why. But again, you have these different disciplines. Which are you going to lean into? What's the strengths of your Varigal, and how are you going to make them unique to how you want to play them? But obviously, all of these options are great for Varigals, and I think that's why it is the primary. But let's get into the potential secondaries and what I think about them, and kind of another suggested domain, right? And some disciplines to maybe look into to further diversify your Varigal. But the first secondary that they kind of give you as an option, because remember, it's either going to be feats or natural environment. Feats is basically all your physical sort of stuff, right? Your ability to swim and run and jump, and you see in the disciplines here, acrobatics, again, includes jumping and keeping balance, climbing, endurance, evasion, running, swimming. Great disciplines, and a great domain for a Varigal, just for obvious reasons. They travel, they're nomadic. They might come across a river or a pond or a lake, or have to travel part of the ocean. Who knows? They might have to climb. They might have to jump over a crevice or a valley, or who knows? But they travel all over Tricazelle, and the land is brutal and diverse. That peninsula is rough. I go over that a little bit in the style and setting crash course, but I am going to do a deep dive on Tricazelle and kind of get into that a little more later down the road. Maybe by the time you see this, it's already out. But ultimately, you can see here, again, like, how are you going to really define your Varigal? Are you going to lean more into climbing? more into general endurance? Are they evasive, or are they more, evasive in running and getting away? Or are you going to lean more into your combativeness, right? Because feats is under your ways combativeness. Are you going to kind of lean more into being able to defend yourself versus being evasive, right? Obviously, a Varigal is more into feats, more acrobatic, right? Because they're going to be traveling and have to deal with all different types of terrains. But again, you can make it any way that you want to make your character unique. And let's notice that where I pointed out before how travel is connected to your empathy way, how this feats is connected to your combativeness way. Because it's going to matter when I show you that the other secondary is also connected to empathy, natural environment. And the third one I'm going to suggest in a moment, that is kind of just out of my personal suggestion, is also connected to empathy. So something to consider is when creating a Varigal, empathy, the way of empathy is probably an important stat to drop some points into. But ultimately, natural environment is kind of what it sounds like. It's the character's aptitude to survive in the wilderness, as well as his knowledge of the rural environment. So you see here some of the disciplines like agriculture, animal training, very important, I think, for a Varigal, fauna and flora, first aid, orientation, survival, tracking. These are all excellent disciplines for a Varigal for obvious reasons. And again, you can kind of see how if you focus on a particular discipline, how your Varigal all of a sudden just comes to life in that direction. For all of these, I think some of the most important directions with natural environment, and I can't make a decision if you're going to pick your secondary to be feats or natural environment. It really depends on how you want to play the character. Feats obviously being a little more adventurous and I would think more evasive or aggressive, depending, but just, leaning more into that physicality, right? Whereas natural environment to me is more like wilderness, camping, still hand in hand with that traveling. But what I love about these disciplines is animal training. I think that's a lot of fun. Even though they don't need to be mounted, they can actually travel faster on foot. I think being able to animal train is pretty cool. And then obviously first aid, because of traveling, you're going to come across a lot of sticky situations where first aid comes in handy. But let's get into my suggested possible domain and disciplines, which is relation. And again, it's linked up to empathy, which is a strength of a Varigal. It's like what we suggest as possibly leaning into as a strength of one of your major ways, right? And if you're doing that, it would make sense that relation might be a domain that you lean into soon after you work on your secondary and major, right? And again, check out Character Creation Crash Course, so all this makes a bit more sense. But look at these disciplines when it comes to relation. Stuff like charm, command, diplomacy, etiquette, intimidation, faction knowledge, and you have to specify the faction, persuasion, sweet talk. I think when it comes to the fact that Varigals are known for being accepted in different kingdoms and different places, because everyone's happy to see a Varigal typically, because they're either bringing you news or some items, something, they're escorting you, you know what I mean? But think about the fact that, if you have some strengths in diplomacy or etiquette, maybe some persuasion, faction knowledge, you can even that much more not only fit in with some of these other situations, kingdoms, locations, factions, but maybe even manipulate, right? Because they're already happy to see. And here again, it depends on how you want to play your Varigal, but here's another interesting way is like, they're already happy to see you. You're getting gigs. You're showing up to a village. They're like, oh, so-and-so the Varigal's here. What news do you bring us, Maybe you're not as golden-hearted as everyone thinks you are, right? Like maybe you're a bit manipulative. Maybe you are persuasive, So just think about these skills in that way. But maybe also it's just you're diplomatic and you have etiquette, when it comes to how you approach people. Maybe that's how these disciplines work in your favor and it gets you favors and bonuses in situations. Maybe you don't have to manipulate or persuade. But again, that depends on how you want to play your Varigal, right? But there's my suggestion with a possible third domain and disciplines. And I hope it was helpful. I hope this deep dive on Varigals got you interested in playing a Varigal. As you can see, there's many different ways that you can play it depending on which domains and disciplines and strengths and talents you want to lean into. But ultimately, they're an interesting character and they're a bit of a leader, right? And they're well versed in Tree Cazal. So I think it's important to also say that whoever plays a Varigal needs to kind of be interested in being a bit of a face of the group, right? Like there's no one true leader to a group. Everyone's going to get their time to role play, be part of the game. If you're a good game leader, and you should, make sure you check out my GM tips playlist on the Cybernation Uncensored YouTube. I go over stuff like this, but ultimately everyone's going to get attention, don't get me wrong, but there's always got to be kind of like a face or two of the group, right? Like the one that's going to kind of lead or be like, all right, enough talking, let's make a decision here, or the one that initially talks when it comes to sticky situations or persuasive situations, conversations, figuring things out, right? I think a Varigal fits in with that. So I think, like I said, it's worth being said that the player that picks a Varigal should be ready to be the face of the group, or at least lead sometimes, not be scared to kind of speak up and role play. So I think an outgoing player would make a great Varigal, but then again, I could also see a Varigal being very quiet and kind of taking a back seat, knowing what they know, but maybe being smart enough to see what everyone else knows first before they show all their cards, right? Maybe that leans into more of that manipulative type of Varigal I was mentioning earlier. I don't know. But again, you see all the options, and I hope it was helpful watching this video and it gave you some ideas. If it did, please give a like, leave a comment. If you have any questions and suggestions and ideas of your own Varigal, leave them in the comments. I love reading about that stuff and being part of your journey in your gameplay, your campaigns, your characters, all that stuff, whether you're a player or a game leader in Shadows of Esteren, right? So again, thanks so much for tuning in. Show me some love. Make sure you show some love to Studio Agate, who put out Shadows of Esteren 2. All the links are there in the description, and I will see you next time in the next video. Take care, everybody.
Cybernation Uncensored.